1 season as my wife, then we're done. The contract ended. His love didn't. The cold was a thief. It crept through the thin glass of the storefront, stealing the scent of the few remaining flowers and leaving behind the damp, metallic smell of winter and defeat. Alara Ramirez stood behind the worn wooden counter of Bloom and Branch, the shop her late husband, David, had poured his soul into. Now it was just a husk, a monument to dying hope. Outside, the first heavy snow of the season was beginning to fall on the town of North Haven, blanketing everything in a pristine, unforgiving white. On the counter, beside a wilting freesia, lay the final notice. Red ink screamed words like foreclosure and immediate eviction. Her hands, stained with soil and calloused from work, trembled as she traced the edge of the paper. It was over. The legacy she had fought so desperately to protect for 2 years since David's passing was about to be extinguished by a mountain of debt she could never hope to climb. She clutched the small silver locket around her neck, its surface cool against her skin. Inside was a tiny, smiling picture of David. She had failed him. The bell above the door chimed, a sound so rare these days it startled her. A man stepped inside, bringing a gust of frigid air with him. He was tall, dressed in a tailored black overcoat that seemed to absorb the shop's meager light. It was Julian Thorne, the town's enigmatic and feared magnate. He lived in the Gothic mansion on the hill, a place of rumor and shadow, and was rarely seen. His face was all sharp angles and severe lines, his dark eyes holding a cold, assessing intelligence that made Alara feel transparent. He looked around the barren shop, his gaze missing nothing, from the peeling paint on the walls to the desperate, hopeful courage in the last few blooms. He walked to the counter, his movements precise and economical. He didn't offer pleasantries. He simply placed a thick, cream-colored envelope before her. "Mrs. Ramirez," he began, his voice a low, resonant baritone that held no warmth. "I have a proposition for you. A business arrangement." Alara stared at him, confused. "I'm sorry, Mr. Thorne, but as you can see, I'm not really in a position for business." "On the contrary," he said, his eyes flicking to the eviction notice. "You are in the perfect position. I require a wife, temporarily. The arrangement would last for 1 season, 3 months, until the spring equinox. In exchange for your time and your discretion, I will settle every one of your debts. This shop, your home, everything. It will be yours, free and clear." The words hung in the frigid air, utterly absurd, yet terrifyingly real. Alara felt a dizzying wave of shock and indignation. Marry him? A man who was a ghost, a specter in their town, a person whose name was only ever whispered with a mixture of awe and fear? It was an insult to her dignity, a desecration of the memory she held so dear. Her first instinct was to throw the offer back in his handsome, unfeeling face. Her pride, the last thing she truly owned, bristled at the thought of being bought. She opened her mouth to refuse, the sharp, angry words already forming on her tongue. But then her gaze fell again on the notice, on the fading photograph of a single perfect rose David had won an award for, hanging crookedly on the wall. This shop wasn't just wood and glass. It was his laughter, his dreams, the last tangible piece of their life together. Losing it would be like losing him all over again. She looked back at Julian Thorne, searching his face for a sign of mockery or malice. But she found none. What she saw, deep within the coldness of his eyes, was a flicker of something else. It wasn't cruelty. It was a profound, hollowed-out emptiness, a quiet desperation that mirrored her own. It was the look of a man clinging to a ledge, just as she was. This wasn't a whim. This was a necessity for him, too. The realization didn't make the offer palatable, but it made it understandable. He wasn't a predator. He was a drowning man looking for a life raft. "Why me?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Because you are respected," he answered, the words clipped and factual. "Because you have remained honorable in the face of hardship. Because you have a quiet strength this town has failed to appreciate. I need a woman of unimpeachable character. You are that woman. His assessment was so stark, so devoid of flattery, that it felt like the truest thing anyone had said to her in years. He saw her. He saw her struggle and her integrity. She took a deep, shuddering breath, the cold air burning her lungs. This was a devil's bargain, a contract signed with her soul. But it was also a choice between a proud, honorable end and a compromised, desperate chance to survive. For David, for his memory, there would be conditions, she said, her voice finding a sliver of its former strength. This would be a partnership in name only, separate rooms, and my work at the shop continues. It is not negotiable. A flicker of surprise, perhaps even respect, crossed his features. Your terms are acceptable. He pushed the envelope forward. The contract is inside. My lawyer is prepared to execute it immediately. Alara looked down at her worn hands, then at the locket resting against her heart. She was making a choice not for herself, but for the love she refused to let die. With a final, silent apology to her husband, she picked up the envelope. The Thorn Mansion was less a home and more a museum of sorrow. It was vast and silent, filled with beautiful, lonely things. Polished marble floors echoed her hesitant footsteps, and ancestral portraits with severe, judgmental eyes followed her from the walls. Julian led her to a suite of rooms in a separate wing, beautifully appointed but as impersonal as a luxury hotel. Your privacy will be respected here, he assured her, his voice echoing in the cavernous hall. He was true to his word. In the first weeks of their strange, silent cohabitation, he was a ghost in his own home. They shared meals in a dining room large enough to host a royal banquet, the length of the mahogany table a physical representation of the distance between them. He was courteous, distant, and utterly inscrutable. Alara found her escape in a place she hadn't expected. Tucked away at the back of the estate, she discovered a sprawling, dilapidated greenhouse. Its glass panes were clouded with grime, and the interior was a tangled mess of long-dead vines and neglected soil. But the structure was sound, and a faint, sweet smell of earth still lingered in the air, called to her. With Julian's tacit permission, she began to work, clearing away the decay, tilling the hardened soil, washing the glass until sunlight could once again stream through. It was here, with her hands buried in the dirt, that she felt a flicker of her old self return. One afternoon, Julian found her there, carefully coaxing a tiny, fragile shoot from a pot of fresh soil. He didn't speak for a long moment, simply watching her work, a strange expression on his face. My mother built this greenhouse, he said finally, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. She loved orchids. She could make anything bloom. He traced a pattern on a dusty pane of glass. After she passed, I couldn't bear to come in here. I let it all go to ruin in that moment. The cold magnate vanished, and in his place was a grieving son. Alara saw the crack in his armor, the deep, unhealed wound he kept hidden from the world. She didn't offer empty platitudes or condolences. She simply looked at him and nodded, a shared understanding of loss passing between them. And for the first time, the cavernous mansion felt a little less empty. News of their marriage spread through North Haven like wildfire. The initial shock quickly curdled into suspicion and then outright contempt. The town that had offered her pitying glances and empty sympathies now looked at her with scorn. They saw a gold digger, a shrewd widow who had trapped the town's wealthiest and most vulnerable man. Her landlord, Silas Croft, a man whose avarice was matched only by his sanctimony, was the most vocal. He'd been circling her shop for months, waiting to snatch it up for pennies on the dollar. Seeing her escape his grasp and land in the Thorn Mansion filled him with a venomous rage. Quite the clever little spider, aren't you, Alara? He sneered one day, cornering her outside the town's only grocery store, weaving a web to catch a big, lonely fly. His words were loud enough for the other shoppers to hear. Faces turned. Whispers followed her down the aisles. Old friends who used to stop and chat now hurried past with their eyes averted. The isolation she had felt in her poverty was nothing compared to this. This was a public shaming. She was no longer just poor. She was a pariah. Every trip into town became an ordeal, a gauntlet of accusing stares and poisoned murmurs. Her virtue, the very thing Julian had sought her out for, was being systematically dismantled and destroyed by the community she had once called home. The weight of their judgment was a heavy, suffocating cloak, and she felt herself beginning to disappear beneath it. The public pressure mounted until Ilara felt she was at her breaking point. One evening, as she sat numbly in the mansion's vast library, Julian entered. He had a file in his hand and an uncharacteristically grim set of his jaw. "I am aware of what Croft and the others are saying," he said, his voice tight with a controlled anger. "I can put a stop to it. I can ruin him." Ilara shook her head, the locket cool against her skin. "That will only make them believe it more. They'll say you're buying my reputation, just as they think you bought me." He sat across from her, his gaze intense. "Then why?" he asked, the single word carrying a universe of meaning. "Why did you agree to this?" It was then that he finally explained everything. The contract wasn't about him. It was about his grandfather's will. The Thorne family fortune wasn't just a pile of money. It was the endowment for the Thorne Foundation, a massive charitable trust that funded children's hospitals, disaster relief efforts, and educational scholarships across the country. His grandfather, a shrewd but loving man, had feared Julian's grief over the tragic loss of his parents and sister in a plane crash years ago would cause him to retreat from the world entirely, letting the foundation be mismanaged. The will stipulated that for Julian to assume full control, he had to prove he could form a meaningful, stable human connection. He had to be happily married for a period of no less than 3 months. "The board of directors is old-fashioned," Julian explained, his voice low. "They are watching. The first woman I considered tried to blackmail me. I needed someone whose integrity was absolute, someone who couldn't be bought or broken. I had my investigators look into this town, into its people. They found you, a woman fighting with honor to save her husband's legacy, showing kindness to her neighbors even when she had nothing. I wasn't buying a wife, Ilara. I was looking for a partner, a guardian for my family's true legacy." The revelation shifted the very ground beneath her feet. This wasn't a selfish act of a cold man. It was a desperate, noble attempt to protect thousands of vulnerable people. Her sacrifice suddenly had a purpose far greater than a little flower shop. It was about saving lives. A powerful, unbreakable bond formed between them in that moment, forged in shared purpose and mutual respect. As the end of the 3-month contract loomed, Silas Croft grew more desperate. His plan to acquire Ilara's prime real estate had been thwarted, and his pride was wounded. Seeing her not just surviving but seemingly thriving beside Julian Thorne was an intolerable offense. He decided that if he couldn't have her property, he would destroy her. He confronted them in the town square, a small, vindictive smile on his face. He held up a sheaf of papers. "I have here," he announced to the gathering crowd, "proof of David Ramirez's secret debts. It seems his little shop was built on a foundation of lies and loans from me, which he never repaid. Ilara has been living a lie. Her saintly widow act is a fraud. The documents were forgeries, but they looked convincing." He threatened to send them to the Thorne Foundation's board, creating a scandal that would not only ruin Ilara's name forever, but would also invalidate Julian's claim to the inheritance. The foundation would fall into the hands of a disinterested corporate committee. The trap was perfect. If Julian used his army of lawyers to fight it, it would look like a powerful man silencing a small-town whistleblower. The board would be spooked, the inheritance lost. Julian's face was a mask of cold fury. He was ready to burn the world down to protect her. But Ilara saw the bigger picture. She saw the hospitals, the scholarships, the lives hanging in the balance. In that moment, her own reputation, even her beloved shop, seemed small. She stepped forward, her back straight, her voice clear and steady despite the tremor in her heart. "You are right, Mr. Croft," she said, the words tasting like ash. "A debt is a debt. I will sell Bloom and Branch. I will sell my home. I will pay you every last cent of this supposed debt to protect my husband's honor." She was making the ultimate sacrifice, letting go of the very thing she had entered this contract to save. all to protect Julian's noble cause. It was an act of profound selflessness. To the town, it looked like an admission of guilt. To Julian, it was the final, irrefutable proof of her character. She had lost everything, but she had saved him. The final day of the contract arrived. The spring equinox. The snow had begun to melt, and the air held the first, faint promise of warmth. Alara was in the shop, packing the last of her personal belongings into a cardboard box. The for sale sign Croft had triumphantly hammered into the doorframe cast a long shadow across the empty floor. She felt a deep, hollow ache, but no regret. She had made the right choice. The bell above the door chimed. Julian stood there, but he wasn't alone. Behind him were two stern-looking people in business suits, and the town sheriff. He didn't look at her with pity. He looked at her with an expression of such profound awe and admiration that it took her breath away. "The contract is fulfilled, Alara," he said, his voice soft but resonant. "You held up your end of the bargain. Now it's time for me to hold up mine." He stepped aside, and one of the suits, a woman with sharp eyes, stepped forward. She was from the state attorney's office. The other was a forensic accountant. They had spent the last week conducting a deep investigation. Julian had initiated the moment Croft made his move. "Mr. Croft's documents were amateur forgeries," the woman announced crisply. "Worse than that, our investigation has uncovered a decade-long pattern of predatory lending, fraud, and racketeering. He has been preying on the most vulnerable people in this town for years." The sheriff stepped forward, handcuffs glinting in the pale spring light. The game was over. Julian had never doubted her for a second. He had simply waited, testing her resolve, and in doing so had given Croft enough rope to hang himself. The reversal of Alara's fortune was swift and overwhelming. With Croft's assets frozen and his criminal enterprise exposed, the fraudulent debt was erased. But Julian didn't stop there. The next day, he presented her with a new deed. He hadn't just saved her shop. He had purchased the entire building, and two adjacent ones that Croft had also owned. He placed the documents in her hand. "They're yours," he said simply. "No debts, no mortgage. A new beginning, but there was more." He called a town meeting. In front of the entire community, he announced the first major local project for the newly secured Thorn Foundation. The North Haven Revitalization Fund, a multi-million-dollar initiative to provide interest-free loans and grants to the small businesses that Croft had systematically victimized. And he announced its new director, Alara Ramirez. The townspeople, confronted with the truth of Croft's villainy and Alara's quiet, noble sacrifice, were overcome with shame. One by one, they came forward to apologize, their scorn replaced by a deep and humbling respect. She was no longer a pariah. She was their hero. Standing on the stage of the town hall, bathed in the warm light of public vindication, Alara felt Julian take her hand. His touch was no longer hesitant or distant, but firm and sure. The entire town was watching as he turned to her, his cold, guarded expression completely gone, replaced by a look of raw, open vulnerability. "The contract for one season is over," he said, his voice thick with emotion, yet carrying to every corner of the room. "It has been the most important 3 months of my life. I came to you seeking a business partner, Alara, but I found something infinitely more valuable." He squeezed her hand gently. I was hoping we could negotiate a new contract. One without an end date. One for a lifetime. I love you." Tears welled in Alara's eyes as a radiant, genuine smile broke across her face. The quiet desperation that had defined her life for so long was washed away in a cathartic wave of joy. "Yes," she whispered, the single word a promise. Yes, in front of the town that had once scorned them, the two lonely, wounded souls who had come together out of necessity, now chose to stay together out of love, forming a new family forged in integrity and sealed by a promise. A year later, the spring sun shone down on a transformed North Haven. The downtown bustled with life, its storefronts bright and prosperous. The flower shop, now renamed Thorn and Thorn Blooms, was a riot of color and fragrance, its windows overflowing with the most beautiful flowers, many of them rare orchids grown by Alara and Julian themselves. The Thorn mansion on the hill was no longer a place of shadow, its windows thrown open to the light, its gardens meticulously tended. In the magnificent greenhouse, now fully restored to its former glory, Julian and Alara worked side by side, their hands in the rich soil. Laughter echoed off the glass panes, a sound the old house had not heard in decades. They had healed each other, and in doing so had healed an entire community. Alara touched the silver locket at her neck, then looked at the loving, open face of the man beside her. She had learned that honoring the past didn't mean you had to live in it. True wealth was never measured in dollars, but in the unwavering strength of one's character, and that a single act of kindness, planted in the coldest winter of the soul, could blossom into a love that lasts a lifetime.